July 1943, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. Japanese tank commanders laughed when intelligence reports described an obsolete British Matilda holding a jungle crossroads, calling it a walking coffin that their Type 95 tanks would crush like paper. What they didn't know was that one Australian sheep farmer and his crew of railway workers and dairy farmers would spend the next 21 days obliterating 140 of their armored vehicles without a single enemy round penetrating their armor. How did 4 ordinary Aussies transform the most mocked tank in the Pacific into an unstoppable killing machine that terrified an entire army? The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting jungle plants. Japanese tank commanders sat in their command tent reading intelligence reports about the enemy they would face tomorrow. When they reached the section about Australian tanks, several officers laughed out loud. An Australian Matilda tank was holding a jungle crossroads somewhere to the south. Just one tank. The Japanese called it the walking coffin because it moved so slowly. One officer named Captain Hideaki Yamamoto wrote in his diary that night. His words were simple and confident. The British tank is obsolete. Our Type 95 Heigo will crush it like paper. He closed his diary and went to sleep, sure that tomorrow would bring an easy victory. Yamamoto had no idea he was about to face Sergeant Charlie Green, a 34-year-old sheep farmer from a small town called Emerald in Queensland, Australia. Green had never wanted to be a tank commander. Before the war, he spent his days caring for sheep and fixing fences under the hot Australian sun. His crew were men just like him. Bluey Harrison worked on the railways in Sydney. Tommy Chen milked cows on a dairy farm in Victoria. Jack McMahon fixed truck engines in Brisbane. They were ordinary men who had been given an extraordinary problem to solve. That problem was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. By the middle of 1943, the Australian Army was losing badly in the Pacific jungles. Japanese tanks were destroying everything in their path. The Type 95 Heigo light tanks and the Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks were built perfectly for jungle fighting. They were fast enough to move between trees. They were light enough to cross wooden bridges. They had guns strong enough to punch holes through sandbag walls and wooden bunkers. The numbers told a terrible story. In the first 6 months of 1943, out of every 100 Australian soldiers who fought against Japanese tanks without tank support of their own, 67 were killed or wounded. That meant more than half of them never went home. At a place called Milne Bay, one Japanese tank company attacked 3 Australian defensive positions. In less than 2 hours, all 3 positions were destroyed. The soldiers inside were dead or running for their lives. The Australians needed tanks. They needed armor. They needed something that could fight back against the Japanese metal monsters rolling through the jungle. But there was a big problem. Every good tank the Allies had was being sent somewhere else. The new Sherman tanks went to Europe. The fast Crusader tanks went to North Africa. Australia got the leftovers. What showed up were British Matilda II infantry tanks. These machines had been built back in 1939. By 1943, everyone knew they were old and slow. The British Army didn't want them anymore. The designers who built them had moved on to better ideas. Even before the Matildas arrived in Australia, soldiers were calling them names. Rust buckets, tin coffins, parade toys. Nobody thought they could really fight. The Japanese army knew all about the Matildas too. Their intelligence officers had written reports about Australian armor. One report from July 1943 said this: Australian armor consists primarily of outdated British infantry tanks with insufficient speed and antiquated design. not a significant threat to our operations. The word antiquated meant old-fashioned and useless. The Japanese were so sure these tanks couldn't hurt them that they barely worried about them at all. Japanese tank crews were taught that the Matilda had thick armor but nothing else going for it. It was too slow to chase them. Its gun was too weak to matter. If they saw one, they could just drive around it or hit it from behind. Some Japanese soldiers joked that the Matilda was so slow that a man could walk faster than it could drive. They laughed at intelligence photos showing the boxy, awkward shape of the British tank. What nobody understood yet was that confidence built on wrong ideas is dangerous. The Japanese had looked at the Matilda and seen all its weaknesses. They counted its slow speed and old design. They wrote reports saying it wasn't a threat. But they missed something important. They missed what happened when you put desperate, clever men inside a machine that could take a beating and keep fighting. Sergeant Charlie Green was one of those desperate, clever men. Back on his sheep farm, when something broke, he fixed it. When a tool didn't work right, he figured out a different way to use it. When a job seemed impossible, he broke it down into small pieces until it made sense. He brought that same thinking to his tank. The crisis was real and getting worse every day. Australian soldiers were dying because they had no answer to Japanese armor. The best tanks were thousands of miles away. All they had were these slow old Matildas that everyone laughed at. The Japanese were so confident that some units stopped even planning for Australian tank attacks. Why waste time planning for a threat that didn't exist? But something was about to change in that jungle. Something that would turn laughter into screaming. Something that would make Japanese tank commanders stop writing confident words in their diaries and start writing about fear. The walking coffin was about to become something else entirely. The obsolete British hand-me-down was about to become the most feared weapon in the Pacific jungle. Captain Yamamoto and his confident tank commanders had no idea what was coming. They thought they knew everything about the enemy they would face. They had read the reports. They had seen the specifications. They knew the Matilda was slow and old. What they didn't know was that speed and age don't matter if the enemy can't kill you and you can kill them. They didn't know that 4 ordinary Australians were about to teach them the hardest lesson of the war. The next morning, Japanese tanks would roll toward that jungle crossroads where one Matilda tank sat waiting. They would expect an easy fight. They would expect to crush the walking coffin like paper, just like Captain Yamamoto had written. Instead, they would learn that the most dangerous weapon in war isn't always the newest or the fastest. Sometimes it's the one you underestimate. The Matilda II was never meant to be a hero. Back in 1936, a group of British engineers sat in a cold office in London and designed a tank for one simple job: keep soldiers alive. That was it. Not speed, not glory, just survival. The men from the British Mechanization Board had watched soldiers die in World War I. They remembered how thin armor turned into death traps when bullets and shells hit them. So they made a choice. They would build the thickest armor anyone had ever put on a tank. Everything else came second. The numbers told the story of what they built. The Matilda II weighed 26.9 tons. That was as heavy as 6 elephants. It could only drive 15 miles per hour on a good road. In mud or jungle, it crawled at 8 miles per hour. A person jogging could keep up with it. The front armor was 78 millimeters thick. That was thicker than a man's fist. No gun in 1940 could punch through it. Inside the Matilda, 4 men worked in a space smaller than a bathroom. The commander stood in the turret, looking out and giving orders. The gunner sat below him, aiming the main gun. The loader fed shells into the gun as fast as he could. The driver sat in front, steering the beast through whatever terrain they faced. The main weapon was called a QF 2-pounder gun. It shot 40mm shells. Next to it sat a smaller machine gun that fired 7.92mm bullets. The tank ran on 2 diesel engines that together made 174 horsepower. That sounds like a lot, but remember, this machine weighed as much as 6 elephants. It was like asking 2 horses to pull a train. The Matilda could carry 93 shells for the main gun and almost 3,000 bullets for the machine gun. With extra fuel tanks bolted on the outside, it could drive 160 miles before running out of gas. The British engineers designed the Matilda to do one thing well: support foot soldiers walking into battle. The tank would crawl forward with the men, soaking up enemy bullets and shells. Its thick armor would keep the crew safe. Its gun would blast holes in enemy bunkers and machine gun nests. Speed didn't matter because the soldiers on foot couldn't run fast anyway. In France in 1940, the Matilda worked exactly as planned. German soldiers shot at them with their 37mm anti-tank guns. The shells bounced off like pebbles thrown at a brick wall. British tank crews sat inside, safe and sound, while German gunners panicked. For a few weeks, the Matilda was the toughest thing on the battlefield, but war changes fast. By 1941, the Germans had bigger guns. The 50mm gun could hurt a Matilda. The 75mm gun could kill it. The famous 88mm gun could blow it apart from a mile away. Suddenly, thick armor wasn't enough anymore. The Matilda was too slow to run away and too weak to fight back against these new weapons. British tank designers moved on. They built the Crusader, which was fast. They built the Churchill, which had even more armor. By 1943, British generals looked at the Matilda the way you might look at an old bicycle when everyone else has cars. It still worked, but nobody wanted it anymore. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, heard that Australia was getting Matildas instead of newer tanks. He said something like this: "We're sending them museum pieces and expecting miracles." Australian tank commanders felt the same way. A man named Lieutenant Colonel Murray Hartnett wrote angry words after seeing the Matildas arrive. "The Matilda is a relic. It can't keep up with infantry. It can't maneuver. It carries a gun that would struggle against modern armor. Our men deserve better." He wasn't wrong. On paper, the Matilda had no business fighting in a modern war. The British had stopped making Matildas by 1943. They built 2,987 of them total, then closed down the factories. Australia got 403 of these tanks between 1942 and 1943, not because they were good, because nothing else was available. Every Sherman tank, every new Crusader, every modern weapon went to Europe or North Africa, where the real war was happening. The Pacific got the leftovers. Australian soldiers called them names: rust buckets, parade toys, death traps. Some crews refused to train on them. They wanted real tanks, modern tanks, tanks that could actually fight. Officers had to order men to climb inside and learn how to use them. Nobody was happy about it. Even the engineers who built the Matilda had moved on to better ideas. The design was 7 years old. In tank terms, that was ancient. The gun was too small. The speed was too slow. The whole idea behind it, that thick armor and infantry support mattered most, seemed outdated. Modern tank warfare was about speed and hitting power. The Matilda had neither. But something interesting happens when you send old equipment to a new place. The rules change. In Europe, tanks fought other tanks on open fields. Whoever had the biggest gun and fastest speed won. In the Pacific, jungle you couldn't see more than 100 yards through the trees and vines. Speed meant nothing when you could only crawl through mud and roots anyway. And those big German guns that made the Matilda obsolete, they didn't exist in the Pacific. What the Japanese had was small, light tanks built for jungle fighting. The Type 95 Hago had armor 12 millimeters thick on the front. That was thinner than 2 coins stacked together. The Type 97 Chiha had 14 millimeters. These tanks were designed to fight Chinese soldiers who had almost no anti-tank weapons at all. Against a Matilda with 78 millimeter armor and a gun that could punch through thin steel like paper, they were in trouble. But nobody had figured this out yet. Not the British, not the Australians, certainly not the Japanese. Everyone looked at the Matilda and saw an obsolete failure. What they should have seen was a fortress on tracks that was about to meet an enemy it was perfectly designed to destroy. Sometimes the right weapon isn't the newest one. Sometimes it's the one that matches the fight you're actually in. January 1943, Bougainville, New Guinea. The first time the 2/4th Australian Armoured Regiment took Matildas into real combat, everything went wrong. 3 tanks got stuck in mud before the sun was even high in the sky. The ground looked solid, but underneath was thick, sticky mud that grabbed the tanks like quicksand. The metal tracks that moved the tanks forward just spun and spun, digging the machines deeper into the earth. 2 more tanks tried to drive around large jungle trees. The Matilda was 26.9 tons of steel. When it turned too sharply, the tracks came off the wheels. The crews had to climb out in the hot sun and spend hours putting the tracks back on while enemy bullets snapped through the leaves above their heads. Japanese soldiers had small anti-tank guns that shot 47 millimeter shells. These shells couldn't punch through the Matilda's thick armor, but they could hit the tracks and the small glass windows the crew used to see outside. One hit on a track and the tank couldn't move. One hit on a viewing window and the crew was blind. By the end of that first day, Australian commanders counted their losses. They had lost more tanks to mud, broken tracks, and mechanical problems than to enemy fire. Corporal James Mitchell was the driver of a Matilda called Bruiser. Years later, he remembered those early days with pain in his voice. We tried to use them like cavalry, fast flanking movements, breakthrough tactics. The Matilda wasn't built for that. She'd crawl along at 8 miles per hour through jungle, throwing up mud, shaking like she'd fall apart. The crew would be vomiting from the heat and diesel fumes. We lost more tanks to mechanical failure than enemy fire. The problem was simple. Australian commanders were using the Matilda wrong. They had learned tank warfare by watching American Shermans and British Crusaders. Those tanks were fast and aggressive. They raced around the battlefield looking for weak spots to attack. The Matilda couldn't do that. It moved at 15 miles per hour on a good road. In jungle, mud, and roots, it dropped to 5 or 8 miles per hour. Asking it to race around was like asking an elephant to run like a horse. Inside the tank, conditions were horrible. The temperature outside might be 90 degrees. Inside the Matilda, it reached 130 degrees. That's hotter than the hottest summer day you've ever felt. The 2 diesel engines roared and shook. Exhaust fumes leaked into the crew space. Men breathed in diesel smoke with every breath. Some threw up from the heat and fumes. Others fainted. Training accidents happened all the time. Private David Walsh lost 3 fingers when a heavy metal hatch slammed shut on his hand during maintenance. 2 crew members breathed in too much carbon monoxide, a deadly gas that comes from engines. They had to be carried out and taken to field hospitals. The Matilda had been designed for European weather, not Pacific jungle heat. The Japanese learned quickly how to fight these slow tanks. They would hide in the jungle and wait. When a Matilda crawled past, Japanese soldiers would run out from behind and stick magnetic mines on the back of the tank. Or they would throw bags full of explosives under the tracks. The Matilda's thick front armor didn't help if the enemy attacked from behind. At a place called Wau in February 1943, 2 Matildas were destroyed this way, not by other tanks, not by big guns, by foot soldiers with explosives who simply ran faster than the tanks could turn around. The crews inside never had a chance. They were sitting ducks trapped in slow-moving metal boxes that enemy soldiers could walk up to and destroy. But then something changed, something that would turn everything around. May 1943, Scarlet Beach. Sergeant Charlie Green was commanding his Matilda, which his crew had named Cunning Stunts. Japanese Type 95. Heigo tanks were attacking. These were the light, fast tanks that the Japanese loved. Everyone expected Green to do what other Matilda crews did. Try to move, try to maneuver, try to chase the enemy. Green did something different. He ordered his driver to stop. Just stop. The driver, Jack McMahon, thought he had heard wrong. Stop! In the middle of a fight! Green's voice was calm. Stop! Let them come to us. The Matilda stopped moving. Green positioned it behind a fallen tree so the tank was partly hidden. Then they waited. 3 Japanese Heigo tanks rolled toward them, maybe 300 yards away at first, then 200 yards, then 100. The Japanese tanks opened fire. Their 37mm guns shot shells at Cunning Stunts as fast as they could load them. The shells hit the Matilda's armor and bounced off. Some made loud clanging sounds. Others made sparks, but none of them went through. The crew could hear the impacts, like someone was outside, hitting the tank with a hammer, but they were safe inside. Meanwhile, Bluey Harrison, the gunner, was looking through his sight. He aimed the 2-pounder gun carefully. When a Japanese tank lined up in his crosshairs, he fired. The 40mm shell left the gun with a sharp crack. It flew across the distance in less than a second. Then it hit the thin 12mm armor of the Heigo and punched straight through. The Japanese tank exploded. Fire shot out of every opening. The turret flew off and landed 20 feet away. 4 seconds later, Harrison fired again. Another Japanese tank destroyed. The 3rd Japanese tank turned and ran away as fast as it could go. Green lit a cigarette and said something that would become famous. See, the Matilda's not meant to chase. She's meant to sit and kill. That was the breakthrough moment, the moment everything clicked into place. The Matilda wasn't a racing tank. It was a fort on tracks. Its thick armor could stop anything the Japanese had. Its 2-pounder gun could punch through their thin armor like it was made of paper. All you had to do was stop trying to make it move fast and let it do what it was built to do. Sit still, survive, kill. Green started training his crew differently. Forget about speed drills. Forget about racing around. Instead, they practiced shooting from one spot. They practiced finding targets quickly. They practiced loading the gun faster and faster. They practiced working together like parts of one machine. By June 1943, Green's crew could load and fire the 2-pounder gun every 4 seconds. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. Over and over without stopping. They had learned that the Matilda wasn't a failure. It was just different. And different in the right hands could be deadly. July 17, 1943, Bougainville Island. The sun was already hot at 9:47 in the morning when Sergeant Charlie Green got the radio call. His Matilda, Cunning Stunts, sat at a place called Junction Blue. This was where two jungle trails crossed each other. Green could see down both trails for about 150 to 200 yards before the thick trees and vines blocked everything. The radio crackled with static. "Charlie, you've got 16 enemy tanks rolling your way. Orders are to delay them as long as possible, then fall back." The voice on the other end sounded worried. 16 tanks against one. Nobody expected Green to win. They just hoped he could slow the Japanese down. Green looked at his crew. Bluey. Harrison sat at the gunner's position, his hands already on the controls. Bobby Hayes, the loader, was stacking shells within easy reach. Jack McMahon, the driver, had his foot ready on the pedals. The inside of the tank was already 127 degrees. Sweat dripped off every man's face. Green picked up the radio and said something that would become legend. "Fall back to where exactly? Tell headquarters we're not going anywhere." He hung up the radio and lit a cigarette. His crew didn't say anything. They just waited. The conditions were awful. Outside it was 94 degrees with heavy humidity that made the air feel thick as soup. Rain had turned the ground to thick mud. Inside the Matilda, the temperature was even worse. The two diesel engines roared and shook, filling the small space with heat and noise. But the crew had learned to ignore discomfort. They had a job to do. At 10:03, the first Japanese tank appeared. A Type 95 Heigo, light and fast, came around a bend in the trail about 180 yards away. Its turret was turning, searching for targets. The Japanese crew inside had no idea what was about to happen. Harrison's gun fired first. The 2-pounder shell crossed the distance so fast it was just a blur. It hit the Heigo's 12mm front armor and punched straight through. Inside the Japanese tank, the shell exploded. Fire and smoke erupted from every hole. The turret flew 15 feet straight up into the air before crashing back down. 4 seconds later, Hayes had loaded another shell. A second Heigo was trying to move to the side, trying to flank them. Harrison swung the gun, aimed, and fired. Another hit. Another Japanese tank burning. Then all hell broke loose. Japanese tanks started appearing from everywhere. Type 95, Heigo light tanks. Type 97, Chiha medium tanks with bigger 57mm guns. 12, 13, 14 tanks total, all firing at once. Shells slammed into cunning stunts from every direction. The sound was incredible, louder than thunder, louder than anything. Each hit made a huge clang that rang through the whole tank. The crew felt each impact shake through the floor and walls. It was like being inside a giant bell while someone hit it with a sledgehammer over and over and over. But the 78mm armor held. Every Japanese shell either bounced off or barely scratched the surface. Some made sparks, some made dents. None went through. Green's crew was safe inside their steel fortress while death hammered on the walls. Hayes was loading shells as fast as his hands could move. The gun barrel got so hot it started to glow. The breech where the shells loaded became burning hot to touch. Hayes's hands were blistering and bleeding, but he kept loading. Load, fire, load, fire. Every 4 seconds, another shell. Third tank destroyed. Fourth tank. Fifth tank. Harrison was shooting like a machine, calm and steady. Each time a Japanese tank appeared in his sight, he fired. Each time he fired, another enemy tank exploded or started burning. Japanese soldiers on foot tried to rush the Matilda with magnetic mines. These were bombs that stuck to metal. If they could get close enough to attach one to the tank, they might disable it. McMahon saw them coming. He opened fire with the whole machine gun, the one mounted in the front of the tank. The machine gun rattled and chattered, spitting out bullets. Japanese soldiers fell before they got within 50 feet of the tank. Greene stood in the commander's position, his head and shoulders up in the turret. He called out targets to Harrison. Tank at 2 o'clock, infantry left side, reload faster. He kept the radio going, talking to headquarters, telling them what was happening. And he kept his crew calm even while the world exploded around them. By 10:19, just 16 minutes after the battle started, 8 Japanese tanks were destroyed or burning. The remaining enemy tanks started backing up, retreating. Their commanders couldn't believe what was happening. Their guns were doing nothing. The Australian tank just sat there and killed them one by one. A Japanese lieutenant who survived later said during questioning, "We were told the Australian tanks were old and weak. Our shells did nothing. It was like shooting at a fortress. We could not understand how they survived." But the battle wasn't over. The Japanese commanders were angry and embarrassed. At 1:47 in the afternoon, they attacked again. This time, they brought infantry, smoke grenades to hide their movements, and better tactics. They tried to surround the Matilda from all sides at once. Greene's crew had been fighting for 4 hours in 135-degree heat. They were exhausted. Their water was almost gone. Their muscles ached. Bobby Hayes collapsed at 2:02 from heat exhaustion, his body finally giving out. Greene had to take over loading duties while still commanding the tank. The crew could barely move anymore, but they kept fighting. Bluey Harrison's eyes were half closed from exhaustion, but he kept finding targets and shooting. Jack McMain's arms shook from tiredness, but he kept firing the machine gun at enemy infantry. Greene loaded shells with burned, blistered hands. By 3:30 in the afternoon, when Australian infantry finally arrived to help, conning stunts had destroyed 14 Japanese tanks and 3 armored cars. The ground around Junction Blue was littered with burning metal and smoke. Not a single Japanese shell had penetrated the Matilda's armor, not one. The crew was pulled out and rushed to medical care for heat exhaustion and dehydration. All 4 survived. Japanese casualties at Junction Blue were 147 killed, including all the tank crews. Australian casualties were 4 wounded. All from Greene's crew, all from heat and exhaustion, not from enemy fire. Captain Yamamoto, the Japanese tank commander, died when his Type 97 Chiha was destroyed by Harrison's gun. His diary was found in the wreckage. The last thing he ever wrote was this: "The British tank does not die. Our shells cannot harm it. This is not the war we trained for." Word spread through both armies like wildfire. The Japanese started calling the Matilda the Iron Ghost, a tank that couldn't be killed. Australian soldiers started requesting to join Matilda crews. And Sergeant Charlie Greene became a legend. The farmer from Queensland who had turned an obsolete tank into an unstoppable weapon. The man who sat at a jungle crossroads and refused to move, refused to die, refused to lose. The proving ground had proven everything. The Matilda wasn't obsolete. It was perfect. And in the hands of men like Charlie Greene, it was absolutely deadly. August 1943. Japanese command headquarters received the reports from Junction Blue. 14 tanks destroyed by 1 Australian Matilda. 147 men dead. The commanders were angry and embarrassed. They held emergency meetings. They wrote new training manuals. They developed new tactics. The Australian Matilda had to be stopped. By August 12th, new orders went out to every Japanese tank unit in the Pacific. The orders were clear and desperate. The enemy British type infantry tank possesses exceptional armor protection. Type 95 and Type 97 main guns are ineffective at ranges beyond 50 meters. New tactics: close assault with infantry carried explosives, targeting tracks and optics, avoid frontal engagement, attack from rear quarter where armor is reduced to 55 millimeters. The Japanese tried everything, every tactic they could think of, every weapon they had. Nothing worked. The first new tactic was concentrated fire. The idea was simple. If one gun couldn't penetrate the Matilda's armor, maybe 6 guns firing at the same time could. At a place called Saddleberg in September 1943, 6 Japanese tanks surrounded a single Australian Matilda commanded by Corporal Dennis Wilson. They all fired at once from different angles. Bang, 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 bang. Shells hit the Matilda from the front, the sides, everywhere at once. The theory was that even if the shells didn't punch through, the damage would add up. Welds would crack, metal would weaken, something would break. The Japanese tanks fired and fired. After counting later, they had hit Wilson's Matilda 47 times. 47 direct hits. The result? The Matilda kept fighting. The armor was dented and scratched. The paint was blown off in places, but not a single shell went through. Wilson's crew destroyed 4 of the 6 Japanese tanks before the other 2 ran away. After the battle, mechanics looked at the Matilda carefully. Massive surface damage, they reported, but 0 holes, 0 penetrations. The tank could still fight. The second tactic was close assault with explosives. Japanese soldiers were specially trained for this. They would hide in the jungle with magnetic mines and bags of explosives. When a Matilda came near, they would rush out and stick the mines to the tank's side or rear, or they would throw the explosive bags under the tracks. The Matilda was slow, only 8 miles per hour in the jungle. A running man could catch it. At a place called Kaya Pit, Japanese infantry tried this tactic. They waited in the bushes until an Australian Matilda crawled past. Then they charged, 20 men running with explosives. But they never got close. The Matilda crews had learned. They now always moved with Australian foot soldiers protecting them, and the Matilda's machine gun mounted in the front could fire very fast. The machine gun rattled and chattered. Japanese soldiers fell before getting within throwing distance. The ones who got closer were shot by the Australian infantry walking beside the tank. The thick armor also meant that even when an explosive did go off nearby, the crew inside usually survived. The blast might damage equipment on the outside, but the men inside were protected by all that steel. The third tactic was ambush with bigger anti-tank guns. The Japanese had a weapon called the Type 1 anti-tank gun. It was a 47mm gun, bigger than what their tanks carried. The Japanese would hide these guns in the jungle, covered with leaves and vines. Then they'd wait for a Matilda to come close. At ranges under 100 yards from the side or rear, the Type 1 could punch through the Matilda's armor. This tactic worked sometimes. At a place called Finschhafen, a hidden Japanese anti-tank gun destroyed one Matilda, shooting it from the side at close range. The crew inside was killed. It was a victory for the Japanese, but it cost them dearly. 2 other Matildas saw where the shot came from. They both turned and fired. The Japanese gun position was blown apart. The gun crew was killed. 1 Matilda destroyed, but the Japanese lost their expensive anti-tank gun and trained crew. The problem was clear. Yes, the Japanese could sometimes destroy a Matilda, but it cost too much. Too many men, too much ammunition, too many guns lost, and Matildas rarely traveled alone. They had infantry support, they had other tanks nearby. If you destroyed one, the others would destroy you. By October 1943, something changed in the Japanese army. It wasn't in the tactics, manuals, or the official reports. It was in the hearts of the men. Fear. Japanese tank crews started refusing to fight Australian Matildas if they could avoid it. Some asked to transfer to infantry units instead. Anything was better than facing those iron monsters. A Japanese officer named Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Mori wrote a secret report to his commanders in Tokyo. His words were honest and frightening. Our tank crews refuse to engage the Australian iron tanks directly. Morale is critically low. Crews request infantry transfers rather than face these machines. The enemy tank cannot be destroyed by our weapons, yet it destroys our tanks with ease. We are fighting an opponent we cannot hurt. A captured Japanese soldier named Private Kenji Suzuki told his Australian questioners about the fear. When we heard the Australian tank was coming, we knew we would die. Our officers told us to be brave, but bravery cannot stop steel. The tank does not care about courage. His voice shook as he spoke. This was a soldier who had faced the Matilda and lived to tell about it. The memory still haunted him. The numbers showed the truth. Between August and December 1943, Japanese tank attacks against Australian positions dropped by 64%. That means that if the Japanese had launched 100 tank attacks before, they now only launched 36. They were avoiding fights. They were hiding their tanks. They were saving them for places where they knew Matildas wouldn't be. When Japanese commanders did use their tanks, they first sent scouts to make absolutely sure no Matildas were in the area. If there was even a chance of facing a Matilda, the attack was called off. Japanese armor was being held back, kept in reserve, used only in desperate situations. The adaptation had completely failed. Every tactic the Japanese tried either didn't work or cost too much. Concentrated fire did nothing to the thick armor. Close assaults were suicide missions. Anti-tank gun ambushes might destroy one Matilda, but lost the precious gun and crew. There was no good answer. The Japanese simply didn't have weapons in the Pacific that could reliably stop a Matilda, and the Matilda's 2-pounder gun could destroy any Japanese tank it saw. The psychological damage was worse than the physical damage. Japanese tank crews had lost their confidence. They had lost their will to fight. When men are more afraid of the enemy's weapon than they are of punishment from their own officers, the war is already lost. The Matilda had broken something inside the Japanese tank forces. It had broken their spirit. And the worst part for the Japanese, they were facing hundreds of these tanks, and men like Charlie Green were getting better at using them every single day. The Iron Ghost wasn't just one tank. It was becoming an army of ghosts. And the Japanese had no idea how to fight them. Meanwhile, Green and his crew were just getting started. Junction Blue was just the beginning. The proving ground had proven the concept. Now it was time to show what the Matilda could really do when backed by industrial might and determined men. Behind every battle, behind every burning Japanese tank, behind every victory at places like Junction Blue was something the Japanese couldn't see, something they couldn't fight, something that would doom them no matter how brave their soldiers were or how clever their tactics became. That something was factories, trucks, ships, training schools, the grinding, unstoppable machine of Allied industrial power. The numbers tell a story that no amount of courage could overcome. The British built 2,987 Matilda tanks, total between 1939 and 1943. Australia received 403 of those tanks. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to what the Japanese had. Japan built approximately two 300 Type 95 Heigo tanks during the entire war. They built around two 120 Type 97 Chiha tanks. The numbers were almost even, but numbers of tanks built don't tell the whole story. What mattered was what happened after the tanks arrived. What mattered was keeping them running, keeping them fed with ammunition and fuel, keeping them crewed with trained men. And in that race, Japan was already losing badly. Every month, Australian factories produced 47,000 rounds of 2-pounder ammunition. That's 47,000 shells that could destroy Japanese tanks. The ammunition came from places called munitions supply laboratories, factories built just to make bullets and shells. Workers in these factories worked day and night, 3 shifts, never stopping. The shells rolled off the production lines like cookies from an oven. Spare parts for the Matildas were made locally at Australian government railways. Workshops. These were the same places that fixed and built train engines. When a Matilda needed a new track, a new engine part, a new gun component, it was all made right there in Australia. No waiting for ships from England, no dangerous voyage across submarine-filled oceans. Just drive the tank to the workshop and get it fixed. Fuel was everywhere. Diesel fuel came from Australian sources and from Allied tanker ships that arrived safely at Australian ports. There was so much fuel that tank crews never worried about running out. They could train as much as they wanted. They could drive their tanks for hours and hours, learning every trick, every technique. Compare that to what the Japanese faced. Every spare part for a Japanese tank had to be made in Japan, then loaded onto a ship, then sailed across the Pacific Ocean where American submarines waited like wolves. American subs were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could build them. A tank part made in Tokyo in July might not reach New Guinea until November. Or it might never arrive at all, sitting at the bottom of the ocean inside a sunken ship. Japanese ammunition was always running short, not because they couldn't make it, but because they couldn't deliver it. Ships carrying ammunition were priority targets for American submarines and aircraft. In October 1943, the Japanese 8th Tank Regiment requested 2,000 rounds of 57mm ammunition. They received 400 rounds. That was all the supply ships could deliver. Meanwhile, Australian Matilda crews had more ammunition than they could possibly use. Fuel was even worse for the Japanese. Japan had to import petroleum from the Dutch East Indies. That petroleum had to be refined into usable fuel, then shipped to wherever the tanks were. Every gallon of fuel that went to tanks was a gallon that couldn't go to aircraft or warships. The Japanese Navy and Air Force always got priority. Tank units got whatever was left over, which was never enough. In October 1943, the 4th Australian Armoured Regiment operated their Matildas for a total of 847 hours. They fired 12,400 rounds of ammunition. They consumed 38,000 gallons of diesel fuel. Every single thing they used was replaced within 2 weeks. New ammunition arrived, new fuel arrived, broken parts were fixed or replaced. The Australian war machine just kept feeding its tanks everything they needed. The Japanese 8th Tank Regiment, during that same month, received 0 replacement tanks. 3 new tanks had been shipped from Japan, but American submarines sank the transport ship. Those 3 tanks were at the bottom of the ocean. The regiment was operating on reduced fuel rations to save gas. Training was limited. Tank crews couldn't practice because there wasn't enough fuel to waste on training, and they only had 400 shells when they needed 2,000. But the real advantage wasn't steel or bullets or diesel. It was people. It was the human system that trained, organized, and sustained the fighting men. Australian tank crew training took about 18 weeks total. First came 6 weeks of basic training where men learned to be soldiers. Then 8 weeks learning their specific job in the tank. Drivers learned to drive. Gunners learned to shoot. Loaders learned to load fast. Commanders learned to lead. Finally, 4 weeks of training with their actual unit, working together as a team. At the end of 18 weeks, you had a combat-ready tank crew that knew what they were doing. About 73 out of every 100 men who started training finished it successfully. That's a high success rate. And the training programs produced 60 to 80 new crewmen every single month. Every month, more trained men ready to fight. When a crewman was killed or wounded, a replacement was available quickly. When Tommy Chen collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to leave Charlie Green's crew, his replacement, Bobby Hayes, arrived within 48 hours, already trained and ready. The Japanese tank training system had collapsed. Before the war, Japanese tank crews trained for 12 to 18 months. By 1943, new crews got 3 to 4 weeks of training, sometimes less. They barely knew how to drive the tanks, let alone fight in them, and there weren't enough trained instructors. The experienced tankers were all at the front lines fighting. The new guys were being taught by men who barely knew more than they did. Live fire training, where crews practiced shooting real ammunition, was almost non-existent for Japanese crews. Ammunition was too precious to waste on training. New crews went into combat having never fired their tank's gun except maybe once or twice. Meanwhile, Australian crews practiced until they could load and fire every 4 seconds with their eyes closed. This created a death spiral for Japan. Inexperienced crews died quickly in combat. More experienced crews had to be pulled from the front to train the next batch of recruits. But that meant fewer experienced crews at the front. And the new recruits were even less prepared than the last batch because the training was rushed even more. Round and round it went, getting worse and worse. Australia could lose tank crews and keep fighting at full strength. Every loss was replaced by a trained replacement. Japan couldn't replace losses. Every experienced crew that died was gone forever. Every tank that sank on a transport ship was gone forever. Every gallon of fuel that American submarines sent to the ocean floor was gone forever. This was the real weapon that defeated Japan. Not just the Matilda tank, not just men like Charlie Green, but the enormous machine behind them, the factories that never stopped, the training schools that never ran out of students, the supply ships that always arrived, the ammunition that always came, the replacement parts that were always available. Charlie Green and his crew were about to take this industrial advantage and turn it into something incredible. They had the best armor, they had unlimited supplies, they had the training, they had the experience, and they were about to show the world what happened when you gave determined men an unstoppable weapon backed by unstoppable industrial power. The next 21 days would become legend, and the Japanese army would learn that you can't defeat a machine that never runs out of ammunition, fuel, parts, or men. November 3rd, 1943, the Huon Peninsula. Charlie Green and his crew climbed into cunning stunts for what would become 21 days of continuous hell. They had no idea they were about to make history. They just knew they had a job to do. Between November 3rd and November 24th, Green's crew destroyed or disabled 140 Japanese armored vehicles. Now, the title of this story says tanks, and that needs some explaining. Here's the honest breakdown. 42 Type 95. Hago light tanks were completely destroyed, blown apart, burning. 18. Type 97. Chiha medium tanks met the same fate. Another 31 Hago tanks and 14 Chiha tanks were disabled, knocked out, unable to fight anymore. That's 105 actual tanks. But Green's crew didn't stop there. They also destroyed 23 armored personnel carriers that carried troops and 12 tracked supply vehicles. In jungle warfare, if it had armor, tracks, and could kill you, it had to be destroyed. The title simplifies it, but every single one of those 140 armored targets was a deadly threat. Total, 140 armored kills in 21 days. The crew never changed. Commander Sergeant Charlie Green, age 34, the sheep farmer from Emerald, Queensland. Gunner Lance saw Corporal Bluey Harrison, age 28, the railway worker from Sydney. Loader Private Bobby Hayes, age 22, the dairy farmer from Victoria who had replaced Tommy Chen. Driver Private Jack McMahon, age 31, the mechanic from Brisbane. 4 ordinary men doing extraordinary things. The conditions were brutal beyond description. The Huon Peninsula was all jungle and rain and mud. Australian forces were pushing north against Japanese positions. Visibility through the trees was 50 to 100 yards at most. Rain fell constantly, turning every trail into a river of mud, and the Matilda operated an average of 9.2 hours every single day. The crew lived with their tank. They slept beside it in shifts, never more than a few feet away. They ate cold food from cans because there was no time to cook. They performed maintenance in complete darkness, their hands covered in grease and oil, fixing problems by feel alone. They barely washed. They barely slept. They just fought. Private Bobby Hayes wrote about it later. We stopped thinking of ourselves as people. We were parts of the tank. Charlie was the brain, Bluey was the eyes, I was the hands feeding the gun. Jack was the legs. The heat, the smell of cordite and diesel, the sound of rounds hitting our armor, it all just became normal. You'd see a Japanese tank, Bluey would fire, I'd load, we'd kill it, then the next one, then the next. The physical toll was terrible. All 4 crew members lost 15 to 20 pounds during those 21 days. Their bodies just burned through fat and muscle from the constant stress and heat. Hayes developed blisters on his hands that got infected, oozing pus and blood. But he kept loading shells. McMahon's hearing got worse and worse from the constant noise until he was partly deaf. Harrison developed kidney problems from the heat that would hurt him for the rest of his life. But they kept fighting. November 17th, 1943 was the worst day, the deadliest day, the day that showed what Conning Stunts and her crew could really do. At a place called Saddleburg, the Japanese launched their biggest counterattack, 31 tanks and armored vehicles all at once. It was the largest concentration of Japanese armor they had gathered in months. Green's Matilda, supported by 2 other Matildas and Australian infantry, held a critical crossroads. If the Japanese broke through, the entire Australian advance would collapse. The battle lasted 7 hours, 7 hours of constant fighting. Conning Stunts fired 287 rounds of 2-pounder ammunition that day. Harrison's aim was so good that 91 out of every 100 shots hit their target. The crew personally destroyed or disabled 19 Japanese armored vehicles. At one point, the ammunition ran dangerously low. Australian infantry soldiers had to run from a supply dump 200 yards away, carrying heavy shells while Japanese machine guns shot at them. They ran through bullets and explosions just to keep the Matilda fed with ammunition. Some of those soldiers died making that run, but they kept the shells coming. Hayes remembered loading so fast his hands moved automatically. Load, fire, load, fire. The breech was so hot I could smell my skin burning when I touched it. Bluey was screaming target positions. Charlie was directing fire and talking on the radio. Jack was running the machine gun. We couldn't stop. If we stopped loading, we'd die. When the battle finally ended, Conning Stunts had been hit 127 times, 127 direct hits from Japanese guns. The paint was stripped away by impacts. Tools and equipment bolted to the outside were shot off, but not one shell penetrated, not one hole in the armor. The tank could still fight. A Japanese soldier named Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka survived the battle. He wrote in his diary that night, "The Iron Demon sat in the road and killed everything. Our tanks burned like matches. I saw the entire third company destroyed in 1 hour. The crew inside that monster must not be human." Other Australian Matilda crews were achieving incredible things too. Corporal Dennis Wilson in Dreadnought destroyed 67 Japanese vehicles during the campaign. His tank was hit 341 times without a single penetration. Wilson survived the war but was killed in January 1945 when his Matilda finally met a bigger gun. Sergeant James Murphy in Bully Boy destroyed 54 vehicles and survived to return to his farm in Tasmania. Lieutenant Robert Cameron in Rambler got 49 kills and later spent his life helping other veterans deal with the mental scars of war. The Japanese veterans who survived told stories of terror. Captain Masao Takeda said years later, "I commanded Type 97 tanks at Saddleburg. We were told to destroy 3 Australian tanks. I lost 9 tanks in the first hour. The Australian tank, Green's tank, just sat there and killed us one by one. We couldn't hurt it. I ordered withdrawal after half my command was destroyed. I was punished for cowardice, but I did not care. Facing that tank was suicide." Sergeant Kiyoshi Yamada, another survivor, said, "The sound of the Australian gun punching through our armor is something I still hear in nightmares. A crack, then screaming as the shell exploded inside. I survived because my tank broke down and I ran away before the Australian tank could shoot. I watched from the jungle as it destroyed my entire platoon. Efficient, methodical, unstoppable." November 24th, 1943. After 21 days, Cunning Stunts was finally pulled back for maintenance. The numbers were staggering. The tank had fired 3,147 rounds of ammunition. It had consumed 340 gallons of diesel fuel. It had received 682 confirmed hits from enemy fire with 0 penetrations. It had traveled 187 miles through jungle terrain. It had operated for 194 hours under combat conditions. The crew was evacuated to field hospitals. Green had severe dehydration, exhaustion, and temporary hearing loss. Harrison had permanent kidney damage and infected wounds. Hayes had second-degree burns on his hands and complete exhaustion. McMahon had permanent hearing loss and shrapnel wounds from fragments that hit the outside of the tank. All 4 survived the war. Green received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery. Harrison and McMahon received military medals. Hayes was promoted to corporal, but the scars never healed. Hayes wrote years later, "People called us heroes. We didn't feel like heroes. We felt like survivors." The war ended in 1945. The guns fell silent. The Japanese surrendered, and people started asking questions. What had really happened in those Pacific jungles? How had an obsolete British tank become a legend? What did it all mean? In 1946, the Australian Department of Defense did a big study. They looked at every tank battle in the Pacific. They counted every kill, every loss, every engagement. The numbers they found were remarkable. For every Matilda that was destroyed, Australian crews destroyed almost 7 Japanese tanks. The ratio was 6.7 to 1. That means if 1 Matilda was lost, nearly 7 enemy tanks died first. Crew survival was even more impressive. 84 out of every 100 Matilda crew members who went into combat survived the war. Compare that to Japanese tank crews. Only 41 out of every 100 survived. less than half. The Matilda kept its men alive while killing the enemy. That was exactly what it had been designed to do back in 1936. The tanks were available to fight 73% of the time. That means if you needed a Matilda for a battle, 3 out of 4 times it would be ready to go, not broken down or in the repair shop. And when a Matilda went into combat, it survived an average of 187 days before being destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Japanese tanks lasted an average of only 43 days. In 1954, the British Tank Museum looked back at the Matilda's service. They wrote something important. The Matilda, obsolete in Europe by 1942, found its perfect environment in the Pacific. Thick armor meant nothing against German 75mm and 88mm guns. Against Japanese 37mm and 57mm guns, it was impenetrable. The 2-pounder, inadequate against German medium and heavy armor, could penetrate any Japanese tank ever deployed. In the specific conditions of the Pacific War, the Matilda became arguably the most effective tank in theater. The lesson was clear. The right weapon isn't always the newest weapon. Sometimes it's the weapon that perfectly matches the fight you're actually in. The Matilda was old and slow, but in the Pacific jungle against Japanese light tanks, those didn't matter. What mattered was armor that couldn't be penetrated and a gun that could punch through thin steel. Tank designers after the war learned from this. They started thinking differently about how to build tanks. Instead of trying to make one tank that did everything, maybe you needed different tanks for different jobs. A tank for deserts, a tank for cities, a tank for jungles. The idea of role-specific design, making a weapon for a specific purpose, came partly from watching what the Matilda did in the Pacific. The Matilda also proved something else. Crew survival matters more than people thought. If your tank crew survives, even when their tank is destroyed, they learn from the experience. They get better. They become experts. The next tank they crew will be even more dangerous because experienced men are inside it. The Matilda's thick armor meant Australian crews survived and learned and improved. Japanese crews died in their thin-skinned tanks before they could learn anything. Modern tank designers still reference the Matilda when they talk about protection. In the 1970s, Israel built a tank called the Merkava. The designers said they were inspired partly by the Matilda's philosophy. Protect the crew first, let them survive. Experienced crews win wars. Today, only 6 Australian Matildas still exist. You can see them in museums. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra has one that's been restored to look brand new. The Anzac Memorial in Sydney has Dreadnought, Dennis Wilson's tank. The Queensland Museum in Brisbane has Waltzing Matilda, a tank that saw real combat. The Pukapunyal Tank Museum in Victoria has Bully Boy, James Murphy's famous tank. The Bovington Tank Museum in England has one that Australia loaned them. And a private collector in Western Australia has Gunner, which has been restored and can actually still drive. Cunning Stunts' Charlie Green's tank was scrapped in 1946. Cut up for metal, nobody thought to save it. Green reportedly said when he heard about it, "She was a tool, a good tool that saved our lives 100 times, but just a tool. The real memorial is that we lived." In 1987, something remarkable happened. The Australian government brought together veterans from both sides. Former enemies met to talk and share their experiences. At a ceremony in Canberra, Sergeant Charlie Green, now an old man, met Captain Masao Takeda, the Japanese officer who had lost his company of tanks to Green at Saddleburg. Takeda brought a gift. It was a piece of Japanese tank armor with a hole punched through it. A 2-pounder round had made that hole. He had recovered it from the battlefield at Saddleberg decades earlier. The two old soldiers stood together, looking at this piece of metal that represented so much death and fear. Takeda spoke first. "I hated you during the war. You destroyed my company. I thought you were monsters." His voice was quiet and sad. Green shook his head. "We were scared kids who got good at not dying. Same as you, I reckon." Takeda continued. "When we first faced your tanks, we laughed. We called them obsolete. By the end, we feared them more than any weapon. I must apologize for underestimating you." Green put his hand on the older Japanese man's shoulder. "Nothing to apologize for. War's terrible for everyone. The tank was just metal. It's the men inside that mattered. On both sides." They stood together for a long moment, two old warriors who had once tried to kill each other, now just two old men remembering the past. They became friends after that day. Takeda visited Green several times over the years. They wrote letters back and forth. When Green died in 2004 at age 95, Takeda came to Australia for the funeral. He stood in the rain and cried for his old enemy who had become his friend. The story of Charlie Green and the Matilda teaches us something important about war. Technology matters. Industrial power matters. But in the end, it's always about the people. It's about ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things because they have to. Green was a farmer who became a tank commander. His crew were railway workers and dairy farmers and mechanics. They weren't special. They were just people who did their job with the tools they had and refused to quit. In his last interview before he died, Green was asked what he wanted people to remember about the Pacific War tank battles. He thought for a long time before answering. "Remember that we were ordinary blokes. I was a farmer. Bluey worked on the railways. Bobby milked cows. Jack fixed trucks. We weren't special. We just did what needed doing with the tools we had, and we didn't quit. That's all. The tank was just metal. We were what made it work." After the war, Japanese military experts wrote their own analysis of why they lost. One report said this: "The Australian Matilda tank was not defeated in the Pacific theater. We learned to avoid it, to fear it, but never to destroy it. Our initial mockery transformed into respect, then into fear. If we had known what those tanks would become in Australian hands, we would have done things differently. By the time we understood, it was too late." The Matilda II, a walking coffin that became an iron fortress, an obsolete design that dominated its battlefield, proof that the right tool in the right hands at the right time can change everything. 140 Japanese armored vehicles in 21 days, all destroyed by the same Australian crew in the same obsolete tank. The enemy learned to respect what they once mocked. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate your opponent. Never assume old means useless. And never forget that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to.